Hi, I'm Carter Wilson, best-selling author and writing coach, and welcome to Motivations for Writers. So lately I've been thinking about how writers define success, especially early on. It's a lot of work to write a book. It's harder than anything most people will ever do. And I think a lot of writers write that novel and think because of how much work it was, it has to be read. It deserves to be published. And maybe this sounds harsh, but I'm telling you, the world doesn't owe you anything. Just because you did something that was difficult doesn't mean it has to be rewarded. I think a lot of writers accidentally make themselves miserable because they define success in a way that almost guarantees disappointment. Let's reframe it in a different way. A writer finishes a novel and immediately starts thinking, this should get me an agent. This should get published. Maybe this will be the thing that changes my life. And if it doesn't happen, and most of the time when you're just starting out, it won't happen, the writer starts feeling like they failed. And that failure often causes writers to quit. But that's the wrong way of looking at it. That's not how writing actually works. I think most writers are looking at what should be considered practice and are calling it failure. And that's an important distinction. I started thinking about this kind of through the lens of sports. So think about tennis. If you look at a professional tennis player, the overwhelming majority of their career is practice. Hitting balls hundreds of thousands of times on mostly empty courts. Drills, conditioning, repetition, learning muscle memory, learning control, learning endurance. I would estimate that a tennis player spends 80 to 90% of their career practicing. Very little of that time is actually spent competing in matches. And an even smaller percentage is spent in career-defining moments that anyone remembers. And that's normal. We all get that. When we think about it and turn it through the lens of sports, that makes perfect sense. Nobody watches someone practice tennis for 6 years and says, wow, what a waste, you still haven't played Wimbledon. But the thing is, writers do this to themselves constantly. They write one manuscript, maybe two, maybe three, and start spiraling because none of them have turned into a career yet. And trust me, I get it. I've written many novels that have never seen the light of day. Writing feels personal. You spend years of something. It's really difficult work. You spend probably more brain energy on writing a novel than on anything else you've ever done. So of course you want it to matter publicly. But I think a lot of writers would benefit from realizing that most of what they're doing early on is training. And that's different than failing. It's training. And some of the books that teach you the most about writing may never get published at all. I'm working with students all the time, and they've rewritten a book dozens of times. And it's a decent book. But it also might be time to stop that book and start a new one, knowing that they had to go through all those revisions and writing that novel in the first place in order to get good enough to write the second one. It was my fourth book that finally sold. And, it was a years-long process between when I started writing and when my first book actually hit the bookshelves. Those early novels, that's where you learn structure, pacing, emotional honesty, or how to finish something. How to write dialogue that sounds like real people instead of book dialogue, or how to survive the middle of a manuscript when everything else suddenly feels broken. My 3 novels that never went anywhere, that was my college. That was my MFA. That was learning how to write because I never had learned it in any kind of professional capacity before. It's practice. It's building instincts. And the strange thing about writing is that nobody sees those years except you. Nobody sees how hard it is. Nobody sees the struggle. Most professions hide the apprenticeship phase. Writing doesn't. Writing makes you stare directly at it, makes you go through it in a way that's painful. And that's part of why it feels emotionally brutal sometimes, because you're spending years creating things nobody reads, revising things nobody applauds, and trying to improve at something where progress can feel kind of invisible. But trust me when I tell you progress is happening. When I look back at my early work, I have memories of how painful it was just to construct sentences. How do sentences work in the creative realm? I had only ever written from kind of a corporate viewpoint, from a very analytical viewpoint. Now, 20 plus years later, the physical act of writing and constructing sentences is far, far easier. And I think one of the biggest things you're learning early on is that endurance. Because, like I said, writing a novel is hard. Writing multiple novels over years while getting rejected is even harder. And I think a lot of writers secretly believe there should be a quicker path than there actually is. And I don't mean consciously. I don't think writers are lazy. I think they're ambitious. But emotionally, a lot of people want to skip apprenticeship. They want to get to the part where they're, quote unquote, a real writer. But I'm telling you, it's the apprenticeship is what's the becoming. It's the career. Again, I was with my literary agent for 9 years before we sold my first book. And now I've been with the same agent for more than 20 years. So when people look at my career now, they're usually seeing the visible part. The books on the shelves, the events, the speaking, the podcast, the career itself. And even within that career, you're always learning. I wrote 10 books. I published 10 books before I had a breakout novel. And every book that I write teaches me how to write the next one. And honestly, I'm grateful for all those years because a lot of us aren't ready. Sometimes the delay is development. Sometimes you're becoming the writer capable of sustaining the career you want. And I think if writers, quite frankly, understood that better, they'd stop treating every unpublished manuscript as evidence against themselves, evidence against their own talent. Your unpublished manuscripts still count. They matter, even the ones that go nowhere. You've learned something writing them. You developed some instinct you didn't have before. You strengthened something creatively. I've said this a lot of times on my podcast, but my 5th published book, which was my 8th written book, is where I found my voice. I can look back on that book and identify it. That's how I write. And it took the 7 books before it to get to that point, to have that kind of enlightenment. And I also think writers sometimes attach their identity too tightly to outcomes. I know I did. It took me years and years and years before I was comfortable even telling people I was a writer. Even after I had already made the USA Today bestsellers list, I was kind of embarrassed being a writer because I wasn't making a living from it at that point. And if publication or, sustaining yourselves financially through writing becomes the only things validating your writing life, then I can guarantee you most of your writing life is going to feel terrible. Because most of writing is not publication. Most of writing is confusion, trial and error, revision, failure, experimentation, starting over. The amount of time, even today, I'm sitting there trying to figure out why a scene doesn't work, trying to figure out why an ending falls apart, or if I'm being true to my voice. I'm telling you, that's the work. That's the practice. That's hitting hundreds of thousands of tennis balls before you have your first match. Once you stop demanding that every manuscript justify itself commercially, writing becomes a lot more enjoyable. You relax a little. You experiment more. You stop writing from panic. You understand this could take years. It could take decades, but you're doing it because you're loving it for the love of the writing and for the love of the learning. You have to stop writing from panic because panic is underneath a lot of struggling writers. They're trying so hard to make this book the one that they squeeze all the life out of the process. Every page becomes loaded with pressure. Every rejection becomes existential. And that's, oh my God, that's exhausting. I think writers often improve faster once they stop obsessing over outcomes every second, because now they're paying attention to the work itself. The sentence matters, the scene matters, the chapter matters. You start asking better questions. How do I make this emotionally sharper? How do I make this scene more propulsive? How do I make this character feel more human? These are the types of questions that are going to help you improve. Will this sell? That's not a question that's going to help you. I also think there's something psychologically healthier about understanding that careers are cumulative. They build slowly, book by book, lesson by lesson, failure by failure. And if you can accept that, you stop feeling behind all the time. The writers you admire almost always spent years writing before you ever heard their name. Years. Not glamorous years either. The years of doubt, of rejection, of trying to improve, of writing things that didn't quite work yet. That is normal. That's the practice. That's the path. And if you can stop fighting that reality, you become a much steadier writer emotionally. You stop seeing every setback as proof that you're not good enough. You start seeing the whole thing as development, which is exactly what it is. So I'm going to say it again. If you only define success as publication, then most of your writing life will feel like failure. And I don't think that's true at all. I think success early on is learning how to finish, learning how to improve, learning how to survive rejection without stopping, learning how to trust yourself enough to keep going. That's real progress. That's all counting. That's training. It's your practice. And eventually, if you stay with it long enough, people may look at your career and call you talented. What they probably won't see are the years underneath it, the repetitions, the practice, the invisible work that built everything else. But that's the part that matters most, because that's where careers actually come from. Now go write.